Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from Delerium, Signs. Delerium is the Canadian new age slash ambient slash downtempo duo of Bill Lieb and Reese Fulber, also previously including Michael Balch or Chris Peterson in place of the latter member of the duo and for certain projects. And if any of those four names sound familiar, it's because this outfit is the long-running side project of the industrial band Frontline Assembly, who I once upon a time did a big video going through their back catalog while reviewing their Wake Up the Coma album in 2019. I believe that was the last video on this channel I recorded before getting that microphone over there. But once I reviewed that project, I had a bunch of their fans tell me that I really ought to be checking out Delerium, and that they'd be a lot more up my usual alley than the main FLA stuff. And while I say Delerium is technically a side project, it's got almost just as deep a history as the supposed main band it spun off from, with a comparable level of success. Currently with 15 studio albums stretching back through 1988, and even one bona fide hit song. In 2000 they made a track called Silence with Sarah McLachlan that reached number 3 on the UK singles charts and got a remix from Tiesto of all people. And since then they've been working regularly with all the biggest famous airy female vocalists in the trance world. From Kirsty Hawkshaw to Jess Breeden to Emily Haynes to Zoe Johnston and tons more. Delerium is a whole separate beast that I could tell deserved to get a whole separate video to be looked at in depth, though I never got a good opportunity to look into them before now, what with their previous album having come out in 2016. I figured with how prolific they are and how prolific Frontline Assembly are that it was only a matter of time before a new album arrived, and sure enough, one day I saw this album topping the iTunes electronic charts and I was like, alright, it's time. So I went back to listen to all the previous Delerium studio albums, and here's my thoughts on their discography so far. Well, this is definitely a downtempo slash new age album made by the same people behind Frontline Assembly. The mix of somewhat slow-paced but still decently deep industrial-tinged grooves with lots of late 80s MIDI orchestration, spooky melodic dark ambience, and samples of Gregorian chants and the like, trying to add up to this ethereal Middle Eastern flavor with some experimental flares, kind of feels like a slightly darker and edgier take on the kind of stuff William Orbit did with his Strange Cargo series. It's definitely on the dated side, but I do tend to fuck with this kind of sound palette. I all around enjoyed it. And this is a step away from just being a regular Frontline Assembly album. It's obviously lower key with more ambient-centric cuts, and it's nearly all instrumental with only one track that includes Lieb's usual strained vocals. But this probably could have been released under the FLA name, and I don't think anyone would have been that thrown off. Still a generally fun time for what it is, though. This one digs deeper into the world music and tribal elements from the first album, but goes about them from a thicker and more rhythmic rather than atmospheric approach, combining them with the industrial grooves for their first release under the name, where I actually kind of felt some higher stakes and like it was carrying some genuine menace without feeling as much like a novelty. Now, that doesn't actually translate to a step up personal enjoyment-wise. It did have a tendency to fall in the background a little bit, but it's not a step down from what came before either. It's still pretty good stuff. Okay, the first track on this album, Lost Passion, is by far the best track I've heard out of Delerium up to this point. The second track, Bleeding, is a banger too, and the rest of the album is pretty much a mix of twisted and formless dark ambience with ideas from the first 3 albums that doesn't grab me quite as much. Again, still solid, might possibly be my favorite of their work in this era, but I wouldn't say I'm completely wowed by it either. Pretty much just copy-paste my thoughts on the last one, except without as big standouts. I mean, still delivering a solid atmosphere as always, I'm probably not going to remember this. Ooh, this is an interesting change of pace, doing away with a lot of the world music influences and spiritual slash ancient tomb kind of imagery, and delivering a lot more straightforward, space-themed 90s ambient techno record with acid synths and the like. Reminds me a lot of something Pete and Amlich would have done, and the occasional choirs and stuff are a really nice touch. I suppose it's less sonically distinct than what they were doing before. There's plenty of albums from this era that sound kind of like this, but it is very well made for what it is, and honestly had me more consistently pulled in than a lot of their previous stuff. And this is where the Enigma comparisons I've heard about came in full force. This album takes a turn towards that kind of very mid-90s new agey electropop sound with lots of standard 90s trip-hop breakbeats, pillowy melodic synths, more very mild world music instrumentation and Gregorian chant sampling, and plenty of airy vocals, all from Christy Thirsk. There is one track that liberally samples the Orb's Towers of Dub and Blue Room that kind of threw me off, but otherwise this is very straightforward and all around likable, as always, if maybe a tiny bit overlong. This album's success would really start to color pretty much all their work afterwards, too. Okay, maybe not quite continuing in the Semantic Spaces direction yet, because this is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a sequel to Spheres that delivers more material in that spacey vein. I mean, it's a little less Pete Nam-looky. It kind of reminds me more of this kind of stuff that Klaus Schulze would go on to do later with his 2000s albums like Moon Lake and all those. But again, solid stuff. Alright, this is officially where the latter half of the Delerium story begins. They got the above-mentioned big hit from this album in silence, and it would start to inform their direction going forward. In the meantime, for this album, I thought their first album sounded like William Orbit, but this one's a near-dead ringer for that guy. Totally sounds in line with the likes of Hello Waveforms and Strange Cargo 3. Not a complaint. Combined with a bit more world music influences again, and more airy enigma-y guest vocalists and actual hired choirs brought in for the Gregorian chanting because that was actually cheaper than sampling. We really do be living in a society. I didn't like this more than Semantic Spaces, but once again it is nice. It's not too far behind. Continuing in the logical direction you'd expect after the last album, featuring a lot more varied vocal guests from Medieval Babes, to Leigh Nash, to Matthew Sweet, to Kirsty Hawkshaw, and a bit of a move away from the electronic stylings. There's a lot less synths here, and a lot more acoustic guitar. And it's a slight step down from Karma, but it's still cool. This is pretty much just the last album again with a slightly different roster of singers. Though there are a couple of tracks that I guess started to dip into some more straightforward trance formulas, which I did particularly fuck with. The tracks Truly and Serenity are big standouts for me. And this is just another repeat of the last three albums. And there might be slightly fewer tracks that have regular English lyrics. The singing here might be a bit more wordless and textural on average, but I'm really scraping to find a noticeable distinction that this project has to set itself apart from their last handful. I did quite like the string orchestration when it's there on tracks like Tectonic Shift, but some parts of this got almost unpalatably generic too. You can probably skip this one. I guess at least this one has a bit more punch behind the percussion, and the very occasional modern dubstep elements are a new flavor, which don't go over badly. Otherwise, it's fine, kinda hit and miss. Some tracks that get my foot tapping, and others that kinda have me cringing at a bit of the on-the-nose lyrics. The Hammer one is eh. Though since the slight modern electropop turn didn't not work before, how about a whole album that goes in a bit of an EDM direction? Look, it's not like festival-ready stuff or anything. It's still in the same down-tempo vein as before, just with more trap beats, synths, and electronic percussion replacing the more organic instrumentation. But honestly, I can't complain about that. It's just the change of pace I needed at this point. This actually hits a similar spot for me that artists like Blackmill can. It fits their style pretty well and is very well executed for what it's going for. I hope it's not too blasphemous to say I think this is one of their best. Which brings us to here. I don't really know what I was expecting out of this marathon, but is it weird that I'm honestly kinda underwhelmed with my findings on average? I mean, okay, I didn't dislike any of these albums. The absolute worst of their catalog is perfectly nice and pleasant, if somewhat forgettable, and their best stuff is solidly immersive and dramatic enough where I'm still glad I took the plunge. But I didn't absolutely love any of these projects either. The best two were Spheres 1 and Semantic Spaces. I also thought the debut, Stone Tower, and Mythology were solid too. Those are in the running. But I don't see myself keeping any of the others around beyond this video, and honestly I'm not sure if even their best ones will end up becoming long-term keepers for me either. They're merely very good and not quite great to me. I think I actually had more fun with the Frontline Assembly Marathon since that stuff was more out of my element. Sitting more within territory that isn't typically in my comfort zone meant there was more novelty for me, and there's clearly something I can get out of their music that I can't get out of the usual artists I listen to. Even if a lot of my favorite Frontline Assembly albums were the ones that ended up closest to my usual wheelhouse, like Flavor of the Week or Epitaph, projects like those felt like they were going about a sound I like from a different angle informed by their different background. Delerium sounds like plenty of other artists I like, and they do have just enough of a recognizable style within this genre that's consistently well executed enough to not be made completely redundant by the William Orbits and Enigmas of the world. But most of their stuff didn't leave as strong an impression on me as I would have hoped, and I feel like I'd have better options available to me if I'm in the mood for their kind of music. Just for one example, there's an album by Robert Miles called 23am in a very similar vein to this stuff, and I think that album's better than any of the albums I just got done talking about. Still, I did like the new electropop direction they started to move in with their last album, so I was cautiously optimistic for this latest album, Signs. And, well, as usual, it's good. Another likable effort, as always, and it does sort of further the dubstep-y sound they were starting to move in before. Although this is a more chill version of that blend that puts them in dangerously close territory to the artist Fela. This album is basically a more pop-friendly and less UK garage-centric version of that guy's sound. If you go back and forth between this album and the project that Fela just put out earlier this year, you'll hear a pretty uncanny resemblance there, both in the vocal tracks and their approach to some of the instrumental cuts as well. Now, I suspect that's entirely by coincidence, especially since Fela isn't exactly the most readily well-known of artists in this field. I'm certainly not about to make any accusation of, ripping him off or anything, and even if they were knowingly following his lead, that wouldn't be a bad thing. I like Fela and don't mind more music that sounds like him. And even if this isn't better, Delerium were able to do the same kind of sound comparably well. I just, once again, didn't feel all that strongly enough about the results where I'd really see myself keeping this around longer term. It's good to decent, but only just. For me, most of the quality was gathered in the front half of this album. The project does get off to a particularly strong start with the first several tracks, the opener, Falling Back to You, maybe somewhat cliche compositionally, but the warm piano ballad instrumental building into this really freaking nice tuneful downtempo cut with some particularly strong airy vocals from Mimi Page did really pull me in right from the get-go. There's also a whole bunch of really nice instrumental cuts scattered throughout the first half as well that sort of build themselves around reversed and looped vocal samples over very chill and serene dubstep arrangements. Be it the lighter but moodier tones of Rain, or the marginally darker and more aggressive approach to Sunstorm in its thicker wubbing bass, and in between the two is an even more hard-hitting vocal cut in Coast to Coast. Again, when I say hard-hitting, that is just a relative term, since a lot of this track is built out of the same mixes of organic instrumentation, light melodic synth work you'd expect, with guest singer Phil Dell also delivering the exact same airy tone of voice that pretty much all Delerium guest singers do. But the percussion on that track is a lot thicker, and the bass has much more of a buzzing texture that probably takes most of the center stage. Even if the melody on that one did wear out on me a little bit with repeat listens, it still remained a consistent highlight. Other highlights include Esk, which has all these washes of bubbly synths going over its minimal and delicate dubstep beats that sound particularly gorgeous. And then Remember Love is technically not an instrumental, but may as well be, since nearly the only lyrics it has is just Mimi Page saying the title of the song a few times, and the instrumentation and production ends up catching more of my interest with how open and spacious it all sounds. All very nice stuff here. Though, the first half of the album does also have one particularly glaring misstep with In the Deep. That was one track I liked when I first heard it, since it does sound as nice as always, and the vocal appearance from Kanga, going up against another more spacious instrumental, is one of the most refreshing and uplifting sounding cuts here. But then I noticed the lyrics, and once I pieced together what it was about, this track immediately got completely ruined and it became quite possibly the worst Delerium track I've ever heard. Now, okay, I haven't exactly been listening to Delerium for the lyrics. Not only does this genre not really need them to be anything special to work, but we are talking about the guys who thought "I'm making love to an alien" was an acceptable line to put in an album. My bar for the lyrics here was not high, and I'm not going into them for anything else on the album since they clearly don't matter. The trouble with this track is that it's about suicide. The singer talks about having attempted suicide several times and goes into detail about the ways she's tried, mostly about trying to drown herself, but it's not portrayed for the sake of like calling awareness to mental health or portraying it in all that realistic a way. Or if that was what it was trying to do, it didn't really succeed at it. It's instead being framed as a regular old love song and portraying suicide as this poetic, romantic expression of the singer's heartbreak, and holy fuck, no, what the fuck are you doing? Why are you trying to make killing yourself sound romantic and alluring? This is the exact wrong tone for this kind of subject matter. I mean, look, if Bill Lieb put some lyrics in a Frontline Assembly album about how you should kill yourself and delivered them himself, it'd still be objectionable, but it wouldn't be this level of indefensible because it'd be obvious he'd just be trying to be a scary edgelord for its own sake, and you could take everything he's saying with a grain of salt. But delivering a track like that with this kind of sound and instrumental and treating it so nonchalantly, it sends a message that I really don't think anyone involved was thinking through the full implications of. It hit such an uncomfortably wrong note for me and ended up completely wasting what would have otherwise been one of the better tunes here. I don't have any moral objections to anything else on the album, though nothing else I have to say on the album is all that interesting either. Once we get past Remember Love, the album kind of slides off and loses my attention with a bunch of tracks that didn't really do much for me. The only track in the second half that I might get behind is Streetcar, featuring Ina Walters, since that's probably the single catchiest track on the album and has the hook that lodges itself in my head the most easily. Come down, down, down from your streetcar named Desire. That's been looping through my mind on and off for much of the past 2 days. Your mileage may vary on how much of a good thing that is, though I wouldn't say it's so much of an earworm to become annoying either. I mean, honestly, a lot more of the past several days I had Freedom by Robert Miles replacing it and looping in my head instead, so I suppose there's only so much power Delerium's hook writing holds over me. But the rest of this album just doesn't really elicit any reaction out of me one way or the other. Glimmer with Emily Haines, it's a track that exists. It sounds like any number of other cuts they've put together over the years. There's 2 more instrumentals in Ambito and The Astronomer, neither of which really worked for me. The former had this vocal chop on it that got pretty grating and unpleasant, and the latter tried for this more generic blend of trained synths and trap beats that ended up sounding a little thin and undercooked. And then the closer, Absolution, kind of just delivers one really generic idea of Mimi Page saying, "I'm ready," in a really high voice over some strings and synth arpeggios that got repetitive and wore out its welcome even before its short 3.5 minutes were up. And that kind of leaves me pretty conflicted on the album as a whole. It's definitely a Delerium album, with all the positive and negative connotations that might end up having for people nowadays. On one hand, there are several tracks on here that did really click for me and really hit in their whole immersive chill step sound with solid tunes and well-textured instrumentals. But, I don't know, that's only about half of the album. The other half was just okay, delivering less good versions of the same ideas with just the one track that I completely noped out on. I don't hate any of this. Even that one track did have the potential to be really good if it had, slightly more generic lyrics like everything else Delerium have ever done. I just don't think this album is all that memorable in the grander scheme of things. It seems pretty middle tier for them, comfortably sitting around high decent territory. It's not their worst album. There's more than enough quality here to put it ahead of their most generic albums like Nuages du Monde. But it's far from their best either. It's a bit of an inconsistent and front-loaded listen, and as mentioned earlier, I'd probably be more likely to return to an artist like Fela who does this sound better. So, I guess take that all as you will, I don't know. I guess all these conflicted feelings average out to me feeling like a 6.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.